To give us an overview of the Chinese overall activity and goals is my guest, David Lee, who runs Australia's only YouTube channel dedicated to geopolitics. One of his goals is to warn Australians about the danger the Chinese government's influence poses to our standard of living as we know it. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Now, Australia and China are becoming more intertwined, not just geographically, as Australia is considered part of Asia, and it's always talked about we're in the Asian century, but there's a big Chinese presence in Australia because of immigration over the past 50 years. In the 2016 census, 5.6% of Australians had Chinese ethnic heritage. 10% of Sydney's population had Chinese background, 8.5% in Melbourne, and there's big Chinese hubs in Sydney, such as in Hurstville and Chatswood. So there certainly is what people call a melting pot happening in Australia, and especially in our two major cities.
Well, yeah, of course. So we are a small population with a large landmass, and we have about 25 million people. We're surrounded by 3 billion people from developing countries, and we've had such a high standard of living for the last decade. We've arguably had the highest standard of living in the world, and so therefore a lot of people from a multitude of demographics would be wanting to try and get in here, of course, and we've had the privilege and the leverage of being able to select the best, mostly choosing the best. But when you say Chinese, there is a difference between, say, North Chinese, South Chinese, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and there's also Chinese people who are pro-Chinese Communist Party and Chinese people that just don't want anything to do with it and they want to get away. That's why they came to Australia in the first place. So I guess the first thing I would like to start with is that there's a huge difference between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And I think all Australians need to be aware of this. The last thing we need to do is be painting them all with the same brush. We do have a rising China on our doorstep, and their plan is to become the Asian hegemon, which spells big changes for us. But we still need to be aware that the Chinese people are our best weapon against the Chinese Communist Party. And if we start painting them all with the same brush, we're going to lose one of our most valuable tools against this oppressive regime.
Yeah, you're not anti-Chinese people. You could argue that some Australians, when they do spout anti-China arguments, they do have a prejudice against Chinese people, but that's not what we're talking about. Their government is a totalitarian one-party system, and the fact that it has 1 billion people over at their disposal, that should scare anybody.
Yeah, of course. Emperor Xi Jinping, he's an emperor. He even Donald Trump recently, in a private conversation, said that you're king, aren't you, Xi Jinping? And Xi Jinping said, just chuckled about that. And that was Donald Trump having a little bit of a shot at his dictatorship that he's developed over there. And you see, we do have, there's only really one Chinese media in Australia. I'd like to bring it up now. It's the Epoch Times. And at the top right of their paper, they mention 330. I think that's the tally. They tally it up with every newspaper. 330 million Chinese who have left the Chinese Communist Party. So they're actually tallying it. I don't know how they gather that data, but they're operating in Australia and Western countries, and that's 330 million people that are on our side, and the side of democracy, the side of freedom, the side of capitalism and everything good in the world, and freedom of speech, and everything that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't stand for.
Now, even though Australia-Chinese relations have deteriorated over the past year with a lot of concern over Chinese Communist Party foreign interference, it's been quite a cozy relationship for the past 10 years. There's been $60 billion worth of Australian exports going to China, and then there's been $40 billion worth of imports, this is per year, coming from China. There was a free trade agreement signed in 2015. If you go to look at Australia's consumer goods, they all say made in China, the vast majority of them. And obviously one of our greatest exports in Australia is education. There's a lot of Chinese students attending our schools, universities. Our education system likes having those students because they're full fee paying and brings in a lot of revenue.
Yeah, of course. I guess when you look at the international system, there's no real police. There's no real. There's no one you can turn to if something goes wrong, and Australia's kind of isolated. We're a long way from everybody else, so we're difficult to invade, and we have the protection of the United States. China has no choice but to pay what we ask. If they want something from us, our resources, they have to pay full fare. And that's because we have the protection of the United States. If the United States left, all they would have to do would be set up military bases around us and pressure us to sell our resources at a cheaper rate. We have a lot in common with Venezuela. Venezuela is in the Asian, under the umbrella of the American hegemon, and so America does not tolerate peer competitors, especially in their region. And they see we have the benefit of being able to call 911, call the United States, or if we have any troubles in our region. And if China was to become the Asian hegemon, we would not have the benefit of calling the United States, and we would have to sell our resources at whatever fee the Chinese ask, because it all comes down to leverage.
Well, we're certainly enjoying selling our minerals. We're one of the most resource-rich nations in the world. There certainly doesn't appear any coercion at this stage, but even though we're not using much of our own minerals here, but that's a whole other political debate, we certainly love sending it over to China and getting money for it.
See, the international system is effectively anarchy. You have to have leverage in any negotiations internationally. And when China negotiates with us, we have Big Brother, the United States, always as like an intermediary the entire time. So that's why they are forced to pay what we ask. For instance, if you look at Iran's oil is going quite cheap at the moment, the same as Venezuela's oil.
Now, the reason I've got you on this week is because ABC Four Corners, it's now their third program on Chinese influence on our politics. They focus on what is called the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which appears to be a network of business people who are designed to get cozy to our politicians, donate money in the hope of influencing things to Beijing's favor.
I guess the best way to look at it is what America does and how America plays countries and the political system, and they try to get rid of dictators and put leaders in that are pro-America. It's the same play that China is doing right now. As China grows and becomes more wealthy, their economy grows, they are going to they're going to demand more respect and more influence. That's just how it works. And at the moment, and for the entire time as Australia's since 1788, we've always had Britain was the maritime power, and then shortly after that, after World War II, the United States became the maritime power in Asia, and then we switched allegiances to America. And now we're looking towards a possible Chinese hegemon, and well, we are going to see a lot of changes, and unfortunately, that might not necessarily be the type of changes that we want, and it might affect our economy in ways that we don't necessarily like.
The Vision China Times. That newspaper was refused sponsorship of the Georges River Lunar New Year festival because of basically a few emails from the Chinese consulate in Sydney. Even though you would think that the Chinese people living in Australia, they're Australian, the Chinese Communist Party, they still care a lot about what information is fed to them and what their perceptions are of the Chinese government back in People's Republic of China.
Yeah, I guess so. That's why there's a lot of Chinese language media in Australia. Scott Morrison and a lot of the Labor Party members and David Coleman as well. They've all been on a lot of Chinese media. I see it all the time. You guys might not necessarily follow any of the Chinese media, but they're always appearing. They're always turning up at meetings. Just because this has only recently been exposed on Australian 24-hour news, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a new thing. It's been happening since the early, since John Howard was in power. It's been a very common thing, and that's part of the amount of money that China has. They want influence, they want power, they want leverage over this country, and that's not going to stop. But you see, part of the problem here is that if we start watching the news and just singling out one little, there's going to be a multitude of problems coming, and the overarching problem is the Chinese Communist Party. And if we just keep focusing on each little problem like this, we're going to get lost into the small little things and losing picture of the big picture, which is that things are changing and that a lot of it is out of our control. Watching the news and feeling that we can discuss these things, if China keeps growing the way it does, we are not really going to have a say in the future. There's not really much that we can do, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're right that we've only begun to talk about it in the Australian political media because of these recent programs. And when you do watch these programs, you're surprised at how many of these Chinese events our politicians are attending. And then you see the photos of all of the politicians at these Chinese events, and then you're really exposed to, wow, our political class, they do a lot of catering to get money and get votes from the Chinese community here. And of course we saw what happened to the state Labor opposition leader Michael Daly when he was talking about Australians being replaced in our cities with Asians with PhDs. That was seen as the main reason he lost the election and why he's been now shuffled out of the leadership.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. That's we live in a multicultural country, and some people are more sensitive than others. It's not necessarily the type of argument or type of things that politicians can get away with these days.
Yeah, but it just shows you sort of our political class. They're aware of the power and the need to engage this community in the Australian political process.
Well, The Australian, I'd say the Australian people say with the British background or the Anglo-Saxon background, they're not as politically active as, say, people from Asia. That's just a fact. They might not. They might only be 5% of the population, or a little bit more, but they're far more politically active, and that it might come across as being a lot more sensitive. But that type of if you don't like what a politician says and you're politically active and you take a stand, you get what you want more. And the Australian attitude of, oh, she'll be right, mate, it's not necessarily helping us politically either. We're losing our voice because of it, because Australians just let things go too easy. And if you talk up and you Australians will often say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory or it's a paranoia if you start talking about, say, China or influence in our politics. Only recently people have started to wake up a little bit and start talking about this and say maybe this isn't necessarily the future that we want. But you see, we haven't seen any of the real negative effects of this global hegemon, this behemoth on our doorstep yet. We haven't really seen any of the real negative effects. And I guess that's what I would like to talk about, is the fact that we are such a resource-rich country. We produce a lot of food that is very valuable. We have a lot of farmland that's very valuable, a lot of resources. And there's a lot of mouths to feed just north of us. And if they can use their leverage politically or militarily, they will, to take what they can from us.
And yeah, it's been "she'll be right, mate" for way too long, and I think that's changing. But let's move away from Australia and look at China as a global player. And you mentioned that Xi Jinping, he's made himself president for life, which is confused a lot of people who just thought, well, he was a dictator anyway. But he's just made himself that he can be a dictator for longer than somebody else.
Yeah, well, he's effectively an emperor now. He's an emperor. He'll be there for life. I don't see any difference between that. A dictator, emperor, same type of thing. One of the arguments that I often hear is China has never invaded anyone. China's a Confucian country, peaceful country. I'd like to try and argue that they're not. When you look at the countries that surround China, how many countries are really scared of China right now? And I guess Vietnam is one country which really sticks out to me. There was a huge war, the Vietnam War, where America caused a lot of trouble. Millions of people died. Now, if you look at the Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese government now, they're in bed with the United States. Why? Because they're so scared of China.
Yeah, it's amazing how things have changed in 40 years.
Yeah, yet we have China, who remembers the 100 years of humiliation, the Opium Wars, and they hold a huge grudge against not only the British people but the French, the Japanese, the Americans. The latest, one of the biggest wars that we've had in modern history is the Vietnam War, and they're in bed with the United States already. They've forgotten about, well, they haven't forgotten about it, but they have no choice but to get in bed with the United States because they fear this soon-to-be Asian hegemon rising. And if you look at Taiwan's scared. They're really scared. Taiwan, only recently, China flew fighter jets over the top of Taiwan just to let them know that we can invade you at any time. South Korea is getting closer and closer to China every day. And when you look at all the countries that surround China, name one that has benefited from China. The only reason why Australia has benefited is because we can call 911. We got the United States to look after us, and we have leverage in negotiations. But look at Mongolia. They're poor. They're so poor. You look at North Korea. It's a basket case. Not one of China's neighbors have benefited from China's rise. And when I go on WeChat, I've found on WeChat that you can buy slaves in North Korea on WeChat.
Wow.
You can hire a Chinese man to go and kidnap a woman in Vietnam for you. Like, this is not a joke. I can show you screenshots.
Yeah, it's a good point that you make.
This is the country that we're dealing with. And Australia's GDP per capita is what, $46,000? It might be down to 45 now. We're slowly decreasing, but China is about 7,000. Their GDP per capita is 7,000. And people say there's 1.3 billion Chinese, but they don't mention the undocumented Chinese. And if you go to China and you go to the rural areas, you realize that there's people that have lived their entire life and they've never been documented. The real population is more like 1.5, 1.7 billion people. So the GDP per capita is a lot lower than what people are reporting. And that's why China arguably wants to have a cashless society so that they can track their enormous population. And if you've got that many mouths to feed, you need to expand. You get to a point where you have no choice but to expand. And there's a lot of agriculture down in Australia, and there's a lot of resources. And the only reason why we have leverage in negotiations is because we're best buddies with the still global hegemon, the United States. But how long that's going to last, I don't know.
Well, one of the potential battlegrounds in the Asia-Pacific region is the South China Sea, which China, they're staking a claim to a lot of the islands there, the Spratly Islands, and one of the strategic partners they're looking at is the Philippines under Duterte. They're trying to turn him into an agent of China. Why is control of the South China Sea so important, and could it disrupt global trade if they gain more control there?
Well, let me answer. Well, I like to call it the East Philippine Sea. Anyway, has the United States ever threatened China's maritime trade routes? No. They have not. And so for all those people out there that say that China is going to rise peacefully, well, they're already proven that they are not going to rise peacefully. And the West Vietnam Sea, or the East Philippine Sea, or the South China Sea, whatever you want to call it, that is a mistake that the Chinese Communist Party made. If they hadn't have done that, we would never know their intentions. It is a red flag to the rest of the world, and that's why. Look at the Philippines. They're poor. They don't really have much choice in the matter, because when Xi Jinping put the thumb on them, and they started to not necessarily do what the Chinese Communist Party wanted, straight away a whole shipment of tons of Philippines bananas landed on the docks in China, and they were left on the docks to rot. And that's how they use geo-economic leverage against the countries around there. And then, they went back in the negotiations. They didn't allow Philippines trade through as soon as and you can't really blame the Philippines for switching sides. They don't have a choice. And also, the Philippines is very important too, because the Philippines is part of the first line of containment. So the Philippines connects with Taiwan, and Taiwan connects with Japan. This is part of the United States' first line of containment for the Chinese. And when we look at this, we call it containment, but the Chinese, they see this as aggression. You see, or you can only look at capabilities. You can never really know what the intentions of another state is. So as soon as China starts growing and they build a little bit a bigger military, we instantly start to see that as aggression. And if you have a look at Asia, the consensus is real. They all believe that China is a threat. And that's why if you look at, say, Japan and India, these guys are best buddies now. But geographically, they couldn't be further apart. Why? Because they fear China.
Despite China with all these ambitions, it hasn't been able to cannibalize Taiwan. It considers Taiwan part of the People's Republic of China. And for those who want to know a bit of history, Taiwan is where the nationalists, when they lost the Civil War, they fled to Taiwan, and that is known as the Republic of China. Hong Kong was a British outpost that's now a special administrative region of China, and they've managed to get a stranglehold in Tibet, free Tibet. It used to be one of the favorite slogans of Hollywood virtue signalers, but and obviously the Dalai Lama is there in exile. So there's these other parts of China which they want to stamp their authority over.
Yeah, I think it was 50 BC. Taiwan was part of the Han. So Taiwan and a small part of China was the beginning of China. So they do have a good argument there. But you see, the real government of China is the government that fled to Taiwan. And you see, that was the government that was fighting against the Japanese. And while that government was fighting the Japanese, Chairman Mao cowardly built a military and started fighting his own people. You see, so that government was trying to fight Japan, and then they ended up having to fight Chairman Mao's People's Liberation Army. And at the end of that, they had to flee to Taiwan. So still to today, we can argue that they're the rightful leaders of the entire China. And well, after Chairman Mao took over, 40 million people died in the liberation of China. And then another 60 million people died of starvation. Now, a lot of people talk about Hitler and World War II, but it pales in comparison to the 100 million people that died after this evil prick Mao. Now, this Chinese Communist Party is still in power in this country. So if you look at the way that they treat their own people, imagine how they're going to treat the rest of us when the United States is pushed out of Asia forever.
China, it hasn't just tried to influence the nations in its region. It's also tried to get nations on side in Africa with a lot of development funds to get a lot of the resources there.
When you look at the Australian people, a long time ago, we used to be adventurers. We used to pride ourselves on, Douglas Mawson hitting Antarctica and Sir Edmund Hillary, climbing mountains but you see, we've lost that adventurous spirit, and that adventurous spirit is very much alive in China right now. There's a lot of Chinese businessmen that are starting up companies and businesses in Africa, of all places, and they're building resorts, and they're building little empires all over the place. And you see, we can't necessarily just blame them for being adventurous and us wanting to stay in Australia and play video games, can we? And I guess part of it is, oh, China's bad, but when I look at it, it inspires me to see them adventuring into Africa. And this is, a lot of those people will be just the average Chinese person. They're not all Chinese Communist Party people too. So it is a lot more complex than that. And you know, a lot of the Chinese people inspire me from day to day when I see them adventuring into places that I wouldn't even go on holidays in. They're just dangerous places. And I was looking at a developer that was building a resort in Africa, and he was saying that you can't put anything down; it gets stolen, and he has to pay $9,000 just to meet a politician over there, and it's inspiring. They're adventurers.
Yeah, well, they've certainly achieved a lot over the past 30 years since they started to open themselves up to the world. And yeah, it's certainly not, as you said, all sinister. A lot of hundreds of millions of Chinese have been lifted out of poverty during that time, and so there is a lot to be positive about for the Chinese people.
I'd love to see more Australians doing it. I would love to see more Americans doing it. Why, there's a lot of Americans that are whining about the rise of China, and then they just stay at home in the United States. There's opportunities all around the world. Get out there, fly to one of these countries, check it out, look for an opportunity. We have powerful currency still today. We are highly educated people. There's no reason why we can't get out there and hit some of these third world countries and develop something and make a lot of money over there, the same way the Chinese are doing it. We should be inspired by it. I'm inspired by in fact, I'm inspired by the Chinese every day when I see them adventuring around the world. And I just think to myself, why aren't more Australians doing it? That underdog spirit, the Anzac spirit, it's non-existent anymore. Not to mention the wallabies. That's another topic.
Australia has largely been shielded from Chinese, not aggression, but strong arming. That's because we've been able to have the United States as a phone a friend. How deep is or committed is the United States to making sure their influence in the Pacific is maintained?
Well, the United States has proven when they dealt with Germany, World War II, when they dealt with the Soviet Union, they do not tolerate peer competitors. And they have their sights. Barack Obama, he coined the phrase, the pivot to Asia. A lot of people thought, what does he mean, pivot to Asia? What is that? Well, it means that there's a peer competitor in Asia, and that's China. And their sights are fully set on China. Now, Australia is stuck in the middle. We still have that policeman in Asia that keeps us all safe. And if you look at the situation from America's point of view, if I was in charge, I would hate to be in charge, by the way, but all America would have to do really is back off, shrink their military expenditure, move back to just a regional hegemon, just control America, save money, stop fighting battles all around the world, and they would have that standard of living that domestically they want, and they would be able to hold on to it for a lot longer. But that would spell doom for us, and our standard of living would instantly overnight collapse, and China would be doing their best to pin us against New Zealand. They'll be wanting to put military bases in the South Pacific. Imagine if there was a base in Papua New Guinea or in Vanuatu. We would want to kick any Vanuatu people from Vanuatu out of Australia. There would be we would have problems with New Zealand. It would be in China's best interest to cause chaos down here, and the reason why: how many Australians lay awake at night wondering if New Zealand's going to invade us? They don't. And you think it's because of the Anzacs? It has nothing to do with the Anzacs. It's because we have a maritime power, the United States, keeping the peace over here. And a lot of people complain about the United States, but it's been the best thing for our region for a very long time. You see, China's already starting to play their card by reducing the amount of resources they're buying from us and increasing it from Indonesia. You see, all of our resources, all of our trade, we're isolated down here. It all goes through Indonesia. If, say, Indonesia was to choose to blockade Australia overnight, we would become a third world country within months. All of our oil is refined in Singapore. So if Indonesia was to blockade us, or some, pirate ships with red flags on it were to start shooting down and commandeering our trade ships, we would be in a lot of trouble. And that would be a real possibility. Don't think that it wouldn't happen. It's a real possibility if the United States is pushed out of Asia. And the United States is going to do what's best for the United States, always.
Trump is seen by some as an isolationist when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, he was elected as America first, but what's the reality? Has he maintained the same policy of influence in the Pacific?
No. When he left the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he just left a massive void for China to fill. And now we're doing our best to sign up countries to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But as soon as Trump left that is one of the worst. That's one of the worst mistakes that Trump made if he wants to have any sort of influence in Asia. And when that happened, a lot of people looked at that as the decline of the United States, China's rise, and a lot of countries became very fearful when Donald Trump did that. And that makes me think that Donald Trump doesn't necessarily have our best interests at heart.
That's certainly a drastic change in policy then. Now, the Chinese government, obviously they do their best to control their citizens at home and abroad, but one of the greatest challenges, and we've seen this recently for governments in controlling the flow of information, is the internet. And a lot of people have talked about the great firewall of China, where Google is heavily censored, Facebook is banned, a lot of the social media is very controlled, all of their mainstream media is controlled by the state.
The Chinese Communist Party is very insecure. And you would be insecure when you look at it's such a behemoth of a country. There's like 62, 63 different languages. Not everybody's Han Chinese. You see, there's a million in Xinjiang. There's a million of the Uyghur population in re-education camps right now. They've had their thumb on. Everybody knows about Tibet and the Dalai Lama. They're constantly worried about external influences, and the internet is one of those influences that they don't want getting in. You see, the whole Tiananmen Square massacre, that was a protest by pro-democracy students in China. they got massacred because of the insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's why when I mentioned that the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party are very different, there's millions of Chinese that want this disgraceful dictatorship with this Emperor Xi Jinping prick to disappear forever, because they do know that it's bad. They know that their friends and family are under a lot of pressure, and people getting locked up, people being tortured. People say that the organ harvesting is not real, but it is real. This Communist Party is very insecure, and if we can somehow convince the Chinese people to overthrow this disgraceful regime, the status quo will be able to remain and we can have our standard of living. But if China keeps rising and Emperor Xi Jinping builds his, rebuilds this One Belt, One Road to Europe.
Yes, can you go into a bit more detail about that project? Because it's another one of China. They have many projects and methods to gain more global influence, and so that other nations gloss over what you mentioned, their human rights abuses, and how, as you mentioned, they are very insecure and try to silence critics however they can.
Yeah, well, they invested, I think it was 30 billion or more, but the last year they reduced it down to 1 billion. It's typical Chinese negotiation strategy. It's try to get you to pay more. So they're trying to sign up countries, but these countries end up paying a lot more than they sign up for. They think they're going to make a lot of money, then they end up losing a port, or they lose part of their infrastructure because of the debt trap diplomacy. The best way to describe it in simplistic terms is all roads led to Rome. You see, this is the old story of the Roman Empire, and the Chinese Communist Party is trying to build and make sure that all roads lead to China. I guess that's the best way to look at it, so that all trade leads back to China. China can be the biggest economy in the world and have the most influence. If the United States gets pushed out, Australia will have to join the One Belt, One Road initiative. Recently, Italy signed up, which is another example of how China negotiates. They want to negotiate with you one-on-one. You see, I guess...
Yeah, because they signed up the Victorian state government, which was pretty unprecedented that a state government would invest in foreign relations.
Yeah, they didn't sign them up. It was a memorandum of understanding, and I read it. It's very vague, and it's not really. It's only really short. It's like one page, and they're signing up. They're having everybody. Almost everybody has a memorandum of understanding with China now with the One Belt, One Road. But you see, if it gets to the point where most countries have signed up to it, and more benefits, it will benefit us more to sign up, we might have to. But if the United States isn't around and they have all the leverage, it's not necessarily going to be fair for us. We're going to be economic slaves to the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a very tough situation we're in, and that leads me back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Donald Trump pulling out of it. He royally screwed us by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a really bad decision, and I don't know if his decision to pull out was representative of the entire United States, but everybody in the know is very scared when that happened, and we are not sure where we stand anymore.
Another program that the Chinese government has rolled out is what's called the social credit program. This was featured on an ABC Foreign Correspondent, where Chinese citizens are rewarded for good social behaviors and punished for bad ones. It's almost like an extreme nanny state program, because it does involve a lot of big brother technology and analysis to work out how a citizen is going about what most of us would consider their private business.
Yeah, so for instance, if you buy health food or vegetables, you get a good score. You buy nappies, it means you're a good citizen. If you buy cigarettes or alcohol, your credit score will go down. One of the extremes would be if you say something bad about the Chinese Communist Party, then you might not be able to. You might become unemployable. You might not be able to rent a place. You might not, in some extreme cases, be able to leave the country ever. And they've got these robo-cops. They're say 1.5 meters tall. Have you heard of them? The robo-cops? They're about 1.5 meters tall, and they have facial recognition software in them, and they go around scanning every face, and they're out on the beat in every city in China right now, monitoring where everybody goes, and they want to know where everybody is, and that's why they're trying to create a cashless society. They want to know where all the money's going. They've in 2016 they put a limit to how much money can leave the country. And at that point, that was when we started to see a lot less Chinese investment in Australian property and Canadian property as well. That was back in 2016. So a lot of people that are looking at the property today, they're like, oh, it just happened overnight. No, it started in 2016. And they're trying to monitor where the money is. They're trying to monitor where the people are. They're trying to monitor what you buy, where you go, what you say, what you do. And it all goes back to the insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party. You see, their legitimacy is everything, and a state survival is the most important thing.
It sounds like that the way you've described the Chinese government, they almost seem like they need psychological help for their insecurities and their overbearing, controlling nature.
Yep. Yeah, of course. Well, you see, when the CFO of Huawei was arrested in Canada, and that was it's not necessarily reported this way, but Canada was getting too close to China. And so I guess the United States had to try to make sure that there was a wedge put between them. As soon as that happened, you could see that I predicted instantly the childish behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. It's tit for tat. Since then, about 14 Canadians have been arrested for no reason, because of revenge, judicial, just arresting people because they want revenge. It's a very immature leadership in China, and very predictable.
Well, you mentioned Huawei there. They've also been in the news in Australia. They've been wanting to build Australia's 5G network, but because Australia is slowly waking up to the influence that China wants to have, everyone's now realizing, I don't think that's a good idea.
I guess when you look at 5G, we don't necessarily know what 5G is. It's a different type of beast. It's not just we have 4G, then we have 5G. It's a total different system, and they can gather a lot of data through 5G. But on Huawei was always going to take over Apple. They've got Huawei, they've got Vivo. Vivo is sponsoring cricket teams in India and Pakistan, and they're selling phones all over the world, and they're half the price of an Apple phone. They were always going to win. I'll be looking to short Apple very, very soon. eventually we'll all, if this is to continue, we probably will have no choice but to buy a Chinese phone in the next decade because they will be the most advanced phones. But on the whole Huawei thing, you see, we've always been choosing our own companies over, say, better technology. We don't always choose the cheapest and best technology. And Gladys Berejiklian, when she was the Transport Minister in New South Wales, she chose to buy this outdated Opal system. And if you've been to Sydney, there's this Opal card system, and it is outdated, it is dodgy, it is slow, the sensors don't really work. And when that happened, I went to China and I was using their system over there, which would have been a quarter of the price to buy. I can put the card in my wallet and scan it, and it will scan through. Far more advanced than we brought the second-hand system, which was the failed system, the Opal system. It was the failed system of the Oyster in London. Why? Not because it was the cheapest and the best. It was because we're playing the same game. Don't buy Huawei. Don't buy anything that is higher and better and cheaper technology. We buy from our allies, and that's how we've always maintained it. So there's also a backstory there as well, you see.
Yeah, that's an interesting point and history lesson to highlight, because there's all these little games going on that vast majority of Australians would have had no idea about. So you've certainly given, I think, all of our viewers and listeners today a lot to think about, and it's certainly been an enlightening conversation we've had. And I'd love to have you back on the show sometime soon if there's any further China developments, because we sort of seem to be on China watch now, even though you've been on it for a number of years. So thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tim. I totally appreciate it.
I left my heart to the steppers round K-Sand. And I saw myself in the cigarettes to the black and marker man. I had the Vietnam cold turkey from the ocean to the Silver City. And it's only the words could understand about long forgotten dark silent guarantees. How there were no V-Day heroes, but back in 1973, and how we sailed in the Sydney Harbour. I saw her from but I couldn't kiss her, and she was landing, I was home to the lucky land.